What would you do if the most powerful man in your life, the head of one of the world's oldest institutions, suddenly said no? Not a soft no, not a negotiable no, but a line drawn in stone, ink barely dry, and a whisper of history weighing on your every move. Imagine the tension in the room, the cameras outside, the world watching, and a single demand turning decades of tradition upside down. This isn't a fiction. This is the story of Meghan Markle and King Charles, a story of power, family, and a confrontation that shook the foundations of the monarchy. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The first reports hit like lightning. Allegedly, Meghan had made a list of conditions to return to the United Kingdom. Not a simple visit, not a cordial reunion, thousands of dollars, royal status, protections, privileges, and promises, all wrapped up in a demand that some said left Charles stunned. It was, in the words of palace insiders, unprecedented. A negotiation that might have seemed routine in other circles became explosive in a context centuries in the making. You have to ask yourself, would you ever draw such a line, even if the world were watching? And here's where the real intrigue begins. What Meghan requested wasn't simply about money or a title. Every royal title carries history, responsibility, and expectation. Stripping or granting a title is a symbolic act as much as a legal one. And asking for a title isn't like asking for a badge or a medal. It's asking for recognition, a nod of legitimacy, and, in some ways, a place in a narrative that spans generations. Imagine asking for that, and asking it in front of the entire public in the court of opinion that never sleeps. How would you react? How would anyone? Now consider the position of King Charles. Here is a man who has spent his life in the spotlight, groomed to balance tradition with modern expectations. He is a father, a leader, a symbolic figurehead for millions, yet he is also a human being. The moment a demand like this lands on his desk, it's more than a financial or legal question. It's personal. What do you prioritize when duty collides with family? The king's advisors are said to have been in a frenzy. Security, optics, precedent. All of it suddenly in play. Decisions that normally might have taken months were compressed into days, hours, and moments that could change everything. This story matters now because it touches on the rawest nerves of the monarchy. The crown has always been a delicate balancing act, but today, modern pressures test it like never before. Public scrutiny, media saturation, global attention, all amplify every move, every statement, every leak. In this environment, even whispers become seismic shifts. And when the world is watching, hesitation can be interpreted as weakness, and reaction can be misread as cruelty. The tension is unbearable. Everyone wants to know, will tradition win, or will personal ambition tip the scales? Before we go further, imagine sitting in Charles's shoes. You've seen the headlines, read the leaks, and watched the speculation spiral. Advisors urge caution, lawyers weigh the consequences, and yet there's this persistent human element. You are not just a monarch. You are a father confronting a grown child who has, in many ways, rewritten the rules. And the stakes are higher than ever. One misstep could have consequences far beyond the palace walls. One word could dominate newspapers, headlines, and social media feeds for years to come. The tension inside the palace is said to have been electric. Phones buzzing, couriers racing, confidential memos circulating in tight circles. Each advisor weighing in, each legal precedent examined, each possibility imagined. Some suggest the king felt cornered, that for the first time in decades, he faced a challenge that threatened both the personal and institutional dimensions of his life. And yet, the public would never see that side of the story. All they would see were headlines. King Charles strikes back, Meghan demands millions, royal drama unfolds. But behind the headlines, the story is far more intricate, far more human, and far more consequential. Consider the psychology at play. Requests for money and status, when made under the shadow of history, are explosive. There is the element of negotiation, yes, but there is also a question of perception, respect, and precedent. If one member of the family can request such terms, what does it signal to the rest? To the public? To the Commonwealth? The ripple effect is enormous. Every action, every reaction, every whispered rumor carries weight. It is like a chess game played on a board spanning centuries, where each move is scrutinized, criticized, and remembered. And then there's the emotional layer. The king is not just a sovereign, he is a father. The narrative of family, love, loyalty, and betrayal runs through the palace corridors as surely as history runs through the monarchy itself. One report suggests the king wrestled with private pain even as he considered the public consequences. Imagine the late-night deliberations, the solitude, the realization that any decision could either protect the institution or shatter personal bonds. This tension forms the heart of the drama, a drama that, unlike a TV series, has no script and no commercial breaks. It is real, raw, and relentless. Now, let's pause and reflect on the scale of the decision. Stripping a royal of titles is not a casual act. It is a declaration. It is a legal, emotional, and historical statement that resonates far beyond the immediate players. It signals boundaries, asserts authority, and communicates a refusal to negotiate beyond a certain point. For Charles, this is a declaration of principle. For Meghan, it is a challenge, a confrontation that tests not just her ambition, but the limits of influence within a centuries-old institution. And for the public, it is a revelation. The monarchy, often seen as distant and untouchable, is human, vulnerable, and fiercely defensive when pushed. The stakes extend beyond palace walls. Public opinion, international media, and social narratives all swirl around the decision. Every reporter, every commentator, every social media user becomes a participant in the drama. The pressure is relentless. The margin for error is microscopic. One misstep could ignite controversy that lasts decades, altering perceptions of legitimacy, authority, and morality. And yet, amidst all this, there is a very personal story, a story of human desire, ambition, and the clash between duty and self-interest. As this saga unfolds, one central question dominates. What does it mean to balance love, loyalty, and duty when the world is watching? How do you act as a parent, a leader, and a symbol simultaneously? And what happens when one person's demands threaten to tip the scales? These questions are not rhetorical. They define the drama at the heart of this story. They shape the decisions, the timing, and the stakes. And as we dive deeper, you will see how each moment, each choice, and each whispered word contributes to a narrative that is as shocking as it is compelling. By now, you might be wondering, what did Charles do? What were the consequences of this unprecedented confrontation? How does a centuries-old institution navigate the collision of modern ambition and historic expectation? Those answers are coming. But first, we must understand the context, the players, the history, and the stakes. Because without context, the decisions, the drama, and the repercussions lose their weight. Without context, the story is just gossip. With context, it becomes a tale of power, principle, and human emotion that spans generations. And that is exactly what makes this story unforgettable. It is not just about money, titles, or negotiation. It is about history, family, and the fragile balance between them. It is about a moment when the personal collided with the institutional, and when one bold, audacious demand, threatened to upend everything. And as we move forward, chapter by chapter, you will see the full scope of that confrontation, the reasoning behind each decision, and the shocking consequences that no one outside those walls could have imagined. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It all started with a message that rippled through the palace corridors like an unexpected storm. Not an official communique, not a formal request, but a demand. Carefully worded, carefully timed, and, by all accounts, explosive in its implications. Reports suggest that Meghan Markle, far from being quiet or conciliatory, outlined conditions that would leave even the most seasoned courtiers blinking in disbelief. Thousands of dollars, royal recognition, security, and privileges. Everything neatly wrapped in a request that some insiders described as unprecedented. Imagine the moment it landed on King Charles's desk. Silence. Tension. A question hovering in the air. Was this audacity or desperation? The first shock was the scale. Money, after all, is rarely shocking in the royal context. Funding, allowances, estates, and operational budgets are part of life at Buckingham Palace. But this was different. This wasn't a request for routine support or a ceremonial honor. This was a demand that, if granted, could shift perceptions, set new precedents, and, potentially, undermine centuries of protocol. The king and his advisors were caught between principle and practicality. Could they say yes? Should they? And what, exactly, would yes even mean in a world where tradition is law and public perception can make or break legitimacy overnight? But let's pause and picture the scene inside the palace. Advisors whispering in corridors, legal teams reviewing precedents, security officers making discreet checks, phones buzzing incessantly, every detail scrutinized. And in the midst of it all, a father confronting a daughter whose public image had already become a global talking point. The tension is almost cinematic, yet it's real. No scripts, no retakes, only the raw consequences of a single bold request echoing through centuries of history. What makes this demand extraordinary isn't just the content, but the context. Meghan Markle's relationship with the royal institution has always been fraught, complicated, and intensely scrutinized. From her early days as a duchess, to the public separation of roles, to the Sussex's high-profile departure from official duties, every step has been analyzed. And now, at this critical moment, the request landed like a bombshell. Return, but only under conditions deemed reasonable by her. Thousands of dollars. A restored royal status. Protections, privileges, and assurances. In essence, a re-entry into a world she had left on her terms. The courtiers reportedly reacted with a mix of disbelief and concern. Some whispered about precedent, historical implications, and constitutional boundaries. Others focused on optics. How would this look to the public, to the media, to the global audience that had followed every twist in this saga? There is a delicate balance in the monarchy between family, duty, and public perception. Too lenient, and it seems the crown bends to personal whims. Too harsh, and it risks public sympathy and backlash. It is a precarious tightrope, and this demand placed King Charles squarely on it. Let's break down the pieces. The financial component, while staggering in amount, is not the headline-grabbing factor. Money is fungible, negotiable, and often confidential. The real shock lies in the conditions tied to it. Royal status, recognition, inclusion in an institution that had, for all intents and purposes, been a stage she had exited. The demand wasn't just transactional. It was symbolic, political, and deeply personal. And therein lies the tension. When symbolism collides with reality, the consequences are magnified. The palace reportedly convened emergency meetings. Legal advisors laid out options, each fraught with risk. Public relations teams drafted potential statements. Security officers recalculated risks. Historians were consulted, unofficially, to assess precedent. And the king, at the center of it all, weighed the decision with both his head and heart. Could he grant the request without weakening the institution? Could he refuse without fracturing family ties? This is the paradox that defined the moment. A simple yes or no could ripple across centuries of history. Meanwhile, the outside world had no idea of the deliberations underway. Media speculation ran rampant. Headlines hinted at tensions, demands, and palace drama, but the true details remained tightly controlled. In an age where leaks travel faster than official announcements, every palace aide, every courier, every legal memo becomes a potential story. The king and his team had to operate under an invisible microscope, aware that every move, every word, every glance could become fodder for global discussion. What makes this story gripping is not just the demand itself, but its implications. If granted, it could redefine the boundaries of power, privilege, and negotiation within the monarchy. If denied, it risks public backlash and personal fallout. And if mishandled, it could create a precedent that no monarch could easily reverse. Every element, money, status, security, is entwined with symbolism and consequence, creating a situation where no single choice is purely tactical or purely emotional. So, how did King Charles react? According to reports, there was no immediate answer. Silence filled the rooms, broken only by the quiet shuffle of papers, the low hum of anxious conversation, and the awareness that history was being written in real time. This wasn't a simple negotiation. This was a test of authority, judgment, and endurance. The king was no stranger to pressure, yet the personal dimension added an unprecedented layer. Here was a father confronting the demands of a grown child, one whose life and choices had been subjected to global scrutiny for years. And what about Meghan? Reports suggest she anticipated resistance but believed the conditions were fair, framed as a return under respect and recognition. But in reality, she was navigating a world that doesn't bend easily, where protocol, precedent, and public perception are as binding as law. The clash was inevitable, one side wielding institutional weight, the other leveraging personal ambition and global attention. It was a collision that had all the makings of a historic moment, one that would be dissected for years. But what truly makes this chapter unforgettable is the human element. Beyond titles, money, and precedent lies emotion. Pride, hurt, loyalty, fear, and determination swirl together in a storm that no observer can fully predict. Every decision made at that moment carried not just legal and institutional weight, but deeply personal ramifications. History remembers actions, but in the palace, emotions rule the day. And in this case, the emotional stakes were as high as the political ones. As the palace debated, deliberated, and strategized, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not just a negotiation over money or recognition. It was a confrontation over authority, identity, and the boundaries of influence within one of the most visible institutions on the planet. And as the hours passed, reports indicate that the pressure mounted. Advisors whispered about limits, about what could and could not be granted. Security teams recalculated scenarios. Every angle was considered, and yet, no single answer felt entirely sufficient. The demand had set events into motion that could not be undone. In a way, it was like dropping a stone into a pond. The ripples would spread far and wide, reaching corners of the monarchy, the public, and the world beyond the palace walls. Every decision, every reaction, every subtle gesture would be scrutinized, debated, and remembered. And yet, at the center of it all, the king had to decide. Could he grant the request? Would he refuse? Or would he find some middle path that satisfied neither side completely? Negotiations within the royal family are rarely public affairs. Behind the gilded doors of Buckingham Palace, decisions are made with the precision of a chess master, every move calculated, every word weighed, and every gesture noted. Yet what transpired in the aftermath of Meghan's demands was unlike anything the palace had encountered in modern history. Typically, requests are filtered through layers of advisors, diplomats, and courtiers. They are polite, measured, and strategic, balancing public perception with private considerations. But this time, the dynamics were different. This time, the stakes weren't just institutional. They were personal, emotional, and volatile. The palace's negotiation playbook is an intricate document, though unofficial. Advisors study history, legal precedent, and media patterns. They consult with financial experts, protocol officers, and sometimes even retired officials who have navigated past crises. Every decision has cascading effects, and every precedent matters. Traditionally, negotiations have been discreet, private, and slow, allowing time for reflection. But in Meghan's case, the pressure was immediate. A demand with a global audience waiting for a response changes the rhythm entirely. The palace could not move at its usual pace without risking leaks, speculation, and misinterpretation. Time itself became a weapon, compressing weeks of deliberation into hours. So why was this situation different? The answer lies in the collision of three factors: history, media scrutiny, and the modern demands of public relations. Historically, royal negotiations were conducted behind closed doors with minimal public interference. But the advent of 24/7 news, social media, and global fascination with the monarchy has shifted the paradigm. Today, every word, every nuance, every hesitation is amplified. Advisors must weigh not only the legality and propriety of a response, but also its public optics. In Meghan's case, the global gaze intensified every decision, every whisper, every proposed compromise. Consider the legal dimension. Granting or denying titles, arranging financial settlements, and negotiating privileges involves not only tradition but codified rules, parliamentary oversight, and constitutional constraints. The monarchy is steeped in symbolism, and symbols are powerful. They communicate values, assert authority, and shape perception. Therefore, the palace had to navigate a landscape where emotion, law, and tradition collided. Every advisor had to ask, if we grant this demand, what precedent does it set? If we refuse, what message does that send? And if we attempt a compromise, will it satisfy anyone? The emotional intensity cannot be overstated. King Charles, accustomed to managing protocol and duty, faced an unusual challenge. The demands came from someone who was not just a public figure, but a family member, a parent-child relationship layered on top of institutional complexity. The usual detachment, the calm diplomacy, the strategic patience, all had to coexist with human feelings, disappointment, pride, concern, and perhaps even hurt. Negotiation in this environment is never purely tactical. It is as much about emotion as about leverage. Every statement, every pause, every facial expression carries weight. History provides examples of similar crises, but none quite like this. Past royal negotiations over titles, estates, or privileges often involved distant relatives, external stakeholders, or advisors. Rarely, if ever, have demands emerged so publicly, with such intensity, and with such far-reaching implications. Courtiers reportedly scoured archives, trying to identify precedent. Could the crown refuse a request without damaging its credibility? Could it grant the request without appearing to capitulate? Every option carried both risks and opportunities, and every choice could reshape public perception in ways that were impossible to fully predict. The advisors' discussions reportedly included intense debate. Some advocated for compromise, arguing that satisfying the request, even partially, could defuse tension and preserve familial bonds. Others cautioned against yielding, warning that any concession might embolden future demands, create a perception of favoritism, or weaken the monarchy's authority. The tension was palpable. Courtiers described the atmosphere as electric, an invisible pressure weighing on everyone in the room. Phones buzzed with updates, legal memos circulated, and advisors whispered about strategies that could minimize fallout. Every movement, every suggestion, every hesitation was measured against both history and the modern gaze. One striking feature of this negotiation was the use of indirect communication. Instead of face-to-face discussions, messages were often transmitted through intermediaries, emphasizing the formality and the gravity of the situation. Legal letters were drafted, revised, and circulated. Strategic leaks were considered, debated, and sometimes rejected. In this environment, even silence became a form of communication. The absence of an immediate response sent signals, created speculation, and forced both sides to read between the lines. In effect, the negotiation was happening on multiple planes, privately within the palace, publicly in the media, and emotionally within the family. Yet the human element remained ever present. King Charles was not merely an administrator. He was a father. Every decision carried the weight of personal connection. Advisors reportedly tried to separate emotion from strategy, but in a negotiation involving family, emotion is inseparable. Pride, frustration, concern for the institution, and hope for reconciliation all intermingled. Each pause in the discussion, each carefully worded reply, reflected not only tactical thinking but also human feeling. How do you balance familial love with institutional duty? How do you act decisively without appearing cold? These were not hypothetical questions. They were daily challenges for the king and his team. Media scrutiny compounded the pressure. Rumors, leaks, and speculative headlines created an environment where the palace's every move was amplified. Advisors had to anticipate not only legal and familial consequences, but also public perception. One misstep, one poorly phrased statement, could dominate global headlines. One erroneous leak could be interpreted as weakness, indecision, or favoritism. The stakes extended far beyond the palace walls. Every city, every newsroom, every social media platform was watching, and the king had to act decisively within this vortex of expectation, history, and emotion. Another unusual factor was the timing. Historically, royal negotiations unfold slowly, with weeks or months for reflection. This time, the clock was compressed. Public attention and internal urgency demanded action. Reports suggest that legal memos, security assessments, and strategic recommendations were drafted and revised in hours rather than days. Advisors juggled multiple crises simultaneously, from internal family matters to the potential media storm. The compressed timeline magnified tension, creating a pressure cooker in which every decision could have immediate consequences. At the heart of it all, the king had to decide: to negotiate or to draw a line. Every advisor had an opinion. Some stressed the importance of compromise. Others warned that yielding would set a dangerous precedent. Every option carried risks, and no choice offered complete safety. In this high-stakes environment, emotion, logic, law, and precedent collided. The usual rules of negotiation, measured, patient, discreet, were challenged by audacity, timing, and the global gaze. And yet, even in this intensity, there was humor, irony, and humanity. Courtiers reportedly joked privately about the surreal nature of the situation: titles, privileges, and demands in the 21st century, all scrutinized by a global audience. But beneath the humor was a profound understanding. The consequences of miscalculation were enormous. This was not just a negotiation over money or recognition. It was a negotiation over the boundaries of influence, authority, and respect within one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world. As the palace navigated these waters, it became increasingly clear that this was a turning point. Meghan's demands, unprecedented in scope and intensity, forced the king and his advisors to confront questions they had not faced in decades. How far could they bend without breaking tradition? How firm could they stand without fracturing family bonds? And in a world where history is remembered, precedent is powerful, and perception is reality, could they achieve a solution that satisfied both institution and heart? What is a title really worth? You might think it's a name on a letterhead or a ceremonial honor, something that glimmers in history books and decorates invitations. But within the walls of the monarchy, a title is far more than that. It is power, recognition, influence, and legacy all rolled into one. And when combined with financial demands, the equation becomes explosive. This is exactly the dilemma Meghan Markle presented: a request that intertwined money, prestige, and public perception, each element amplifying the other in ways that could not be ignored. Let's start with the financial aspect. Thousands of dollars, some reports speculate into the millions, were allegedly requested as part of a return agreement. To a typical citizen, that number might seem astronomical. To a royal institution, it's significant, but not unprecedented. The Crown has historically provided for its members, supporting not just lifestyles but security, estates, staff, and public obligations. However, it's not just about the amount. It's about what the money represents. In this case, the funds were tied explicitly to a return, a condition-laden re-entry into a world Meghan had formally distanced herself from. Money wasn't a reward, it was a prerequisite. And that made it personal, political, and profoundly consequential. Now consider titles. Titles are not just symbolic. They are legal instruments, markers of hierarchy, and tools of influence. A royal title confers privilege but also responsibility, aligning the holder with centuries of tradition and public scrutiny. Stripping or granting a title is never done lightly. It signals authority, communicates values, and sometimes even shapes diplomacy. A request for restored titles, therefore, is not a trivial matter. It is a negotiation over recognition, legacy, and the boundaries of personal ambition versus institutional integrity. In this case, Meghan's alleged request challenged more than protocol. It challenged history. The monarchy operates under centuries of unwritten rules, inherited wisdom, and legal precedent. Every title has been bestowed with care, with symbolism in mind. Every financial settlement has been calculated to balance duty, image, and public perception. To insert conditions into the equation is to disrupt a delicate equilibrium, one that has been maintained over generations. The king and his advisors were not just deciding on money or recognition. They were deciding on the future tone of the monarchy itself. The symbolism extends further. A restored title would have allowed Meghan to re-enter the monarchy under specific conditions, signaling not just acceptance but approval. It's one thing to return as a private citizen, free from obligation, and another to return with recognition. Recognition carries weight, influence, and optics. It communicates to the public, the family, and the global audience that she remains a central figure in the royal narrative. And that is why the request was so shocking. It wasn't just a financial negotiation. It was a political, social, and emotional challenge wrapped in one. Imagine the conversations behind palace walls. Legal teams dissecting historical precedents, advisors calculating public perception, and courtiers debating optics. What would granting this request communicate? Could it be framed as a gesture of goodwill, or would it be seen as capitulation? And if denied, what would be the public reaction? The possibilities are endless, and every decision carries ramifications far beyond the immediate moment. In essence, the king was being asked to weigh money, status, family, and tradition all at once, under intense scrutiny, and with time compressed to a fraction of what would normally allow careful consideration. The emotional weight of these considerations is impossible to overstate. On one hand, Charles faced the practical implications. The legal, financial, and procedural consequences of granting or denying the request. On the other, there were deeply personal factors, the feelings of family, the strain on relationships, and the potential fallout from public perception. To balance these competing demands is a task few outside the palace can truly comprehend. And yet, history often remembers only the decision, not the deliberations, not the human calculations, not the emotional toll that accompanies it. Adding to the complexity was the global attention focused on the situation. Meghan Markle is not merely a former duchess. She is a public figure, media magnet, and symbol in her own right. Every move she makes is amplified, every statement dissected, every appearance scrutinized. For the monarchy, this creates an environment where decisions are not just internal, they are global events. Advisors had to anticipate not only the legal and familial consequences, but also how the world would interpret every gesture. One misstep could dominate headlines, social media trends, and public discourse for months. In this high-stakes arena, money and titles become more than instruments. They are messages. And there is irony here. While Meghan's request for money and recognition might appear transactional, it also reflects a deeper understanding of power dynamics. Titles carry legitimacy, influence, and access. Money provides security, autonomy, and leverage. Combined, they create a package that is difficult for any institution, even one as entrenched as the British monarchy, to negotiate against. The request, in essence, was a strategic move that tested boundaries, measured resolve, and forced the crown to confront both precedent and principle simultaneously. The palace reportedly considered numerous responses. Some advisors recommended partial concessions, framing them as goodwill or compromise. Others argued for firm refusal, emphasizing the need to maintain authority and set clear boundaries. Every option was scrutinized, every word of potential communication dissected. Timing, phrasing, and context mattered as much as the substance of the decision itself. In other words, this was negotiation elevated to an art form, where emotional, historical, legal, and public elements were inseparably intertwined. Then there was the element of precedent. The monarchy is a centuries-old institution, deeply rooted in tradition. What happens when precedent is broken, or appears to be broken? Granting Meghan's requests could have far-reaching consequences, emboldening future claims or altering public perception of royal authority. Refusal, conversely, could be interpreted as coldness or rigidity, particularly in a world attuned to narratives of family tension and personal drama. Either way, the king's choice would be scrutinized, debated, and remembered. Public perception adds another layer of complexity. Royals are symbols, not just individuals. Every decision communicates values, priorities, and boundaries. The balance between private family matters and public accountability is delicate. How do you maintain authority while appearing fair? How do you respect tradition while navigating modern expectations? These questions are not theoretical. They define the pressures on the king and his advisors, and they magnify the stakes of every dollar and every title. Ultimately, the drama of money and titles is inseparable from emotion. Pride, ambition, loyalty, and hurt all intersect in this negotiation. The king was confronted with not only the institutional implications, but also the deeply personal ramifications. The question of how far to accommodate, how firmly to resist, and how to balance duty with feeling. And as advisors debated, as legal teams assessed, as public perception simmered, one fact became clear. This was not just about money or recognition. It was about boundaries, respect, and the limits of influence within the monarchy. And yet, even in this intense pressure, uncertainty remained. No one could predict the outcome. No historical template perfectly fit this scenario. Every option carried risk, and every decision had consequences that could reverberate for years. The king and his advisors faced a unique challenge: to respond decisively, protect the institution, and navigate the emotional currents of a family divided by distance, ambition, and media scrutiny. Every choice was a test of judgment, authority, and human understanding. Imagine being King Charles, a lifetime spent preparing to rule, mastering the delicate balance between tradition and change, duty and desire. Now, picture being confronted with a demand that tests the very core of that preparation. This wasn't a simple yes or no question. It wasn't a routine negotiation. It was a deeply personal, profoundly complex moment, one that placed a father against a monarch, a private relationship against centuries of institutional expectation. The dilemma was staggering. How do you reconcile the heart with the crown when the two are at odds? At first glance, the king's position might seem simple. Monarchs have authority. They make decisions. They wield symbolic and legal power that few can challenge. But in reality, every decision comes with weight. Historical, familial, public, and moral. To grant Meghan's requests could be seen as yielding to personal ambition. To deny them could fracture family ties and invite scrutiny or even public sympathy for the one being refused. It's a paradox. Any action or inaction has consequences, and none are risk-free. The personal dimension intensified the pressure. Charles is not merely a sovereign. He is a father. He has watched his children grow, witnessed their triumphs and struggles, and faced the relentless gaze of public scrutiny alongside them. To weigh a financial demand and a request for restored titles isn't just a matter of policy. It's a measure of love, judgment, and trust. How do you balance institutional responsibility with personal loyalty? How do you act as a father without compromising the integrity of the crown? These questions are not academic. They define the tension within the palace walls. Inside the palace, advisors reportedly worked frantically, balancing legal frameworks with public optics, protocol with emotion. Every memo, every briefing, every whispered counsel aimed to guide the king toward a decision that protected the monarchy and, if possible, preserved family harmony. But even with expert advice, the decision ultimately rested with Charles. He had to consider history, precedent, and the expectations of millions, all while managing his private emotions and family bonds. It was a task that demanded clarity, patience, and courage in equal measure. There was also the weight of global scrutiny. Charles's decisions are never isolated. They resonate across continents. The Commonwealth watches, the media analyzes, and the public debates. Every word, every gesture, every nuance can be amplified and interpreted in ways the monarchy cannot fully control. This reality intensified the stakes, turning what might have been a private negotiation into a high-profile, global event. The pressure was immense, the scrutiny relentless, and the consequences potentially enduring. Emotionally, the king faced a paradox. He wanted to maintain family unity, to act with compassion and fairness. Yet he also needed to uphold the authority of the crown, protect centuries of tradition, and ensure the stability of the monarchy. Each instinct pulled in a different direction. Advisors reported that he wrestled with conflicting desires: the desire to protect his child, the desire to defend the institution, and the desire to act decisively in a situation that had no perfect solution. This was leadership at its most human, most complicated, and most consequential. The advisors themselves were caught in the tension. Some advocated for a softer, conciliatory approach, emphasizing empathy and familial loyalty. Others urged firmness, warning that concessions could create dangerous precedent and weaken the perception of authority. Legal counsel weighed in, highlighting potential ramifications, procedural hurdles, and constitutional implications. Public relations teams considered messaging, optics, and potential narratives. The environment was a pressure cooker, with every player aware that their recommendations could shape history and influence the monarchy for years to come. Adding complexity were the rumors and leaks circulating in the media. Social media magnified speculation, creating a climate in which the palace's every move was interpreted, misinterpreted, and amplified. The king had to navigate this noise while maintaining composure, ensuring that private deliberations did not become public spectacle. This delicate balance is one that monarchs have faced for centuries, but the intensity of modern scrutiny transformed every decision into a public statement, whether intended or not. Historically, royal figures have faced moments of personal versus institutional conflict. Monarchs have had to weigh private loyalty against public duty, personal feeling against the broader needs of the institution. But rarely has such a clash occurred under the direct gaze of a global audience. In this case, Charles's dilemma was magnified by both the personal stakes, his child's demands, and the public stakes, the perception of leadership, authority, and fairness. It was, in many ways, a perfect storm of conflicting pressures. Emotionally, the king had to confront not just the demands themselves, but their implications for his relationship with Meghan and the wider family. Could he maintain authority without alienating loved ones? Could he act decisively without appearing unfeeling? Could he defend tradition without appearing inflexible? The answers were not clear, and the consequences of misjudgment were enormous. This is the human side of monarchy, the collision of duty, emotion, and historical weight, all converging in a single, high-stakes moment. Every advisor, every legal counsel, every protocol officer knew the stakes. Even the smallest action, a glance, a phrase, a letter, could ripple through the palace and beyond. Decisions were weighed, revised, debated, and reconsidered. And yet, despite all expertise, the ultimate responsibility rested with the king. He had to reconcile heart and crown, family and institution, emotion and strategy. No amount of counsel could resolve the inner conflict. That was a burden only he could bear. Time itself became an enemy. The demand could not linger unanswered for long. Every hour increased the potential for leaks, speculation, and public pressure. The palace had to act with precision, yet carefully enough to avoid rashness. Charles had to consider not only the immediate reaction but the long-term implications. How would future generations interpret his decision? How would it influence the perception of monarchy, of justice, and of leadership? And how would it affect his relationship with his children? At its core, the dilemma was deeply human. Leadership is often viewed through a lens of power and authority, but moments like this reveal the vulnerabilities beneath the crown. Charles had to make a decision that balanced the personal and the political, emotion and duty, family and institution. Every choice carried weight, every hesitation carried risk, and every action could shape both personal legacy and historical memory. And as advisors deliberated, as media speculated, and as history waited, the king's decision loomed. He understood that there was no perfect solution, only the best one he could make in a moment of unprecedented pressure. The stakes were monumental, the scrutiny intense, and the consequences potentially historic. It was a crucible, a defining moment that would test not only his leadership, but his humanity. When a story like this hits the headlines, the public often asks, does the king even have the power to do that? It sounds simple. After all, monarchs are symbols of authority, tradition, and continuity. But the reality is far more complex. The British monarchy operates in a delicate balance of history, law, precedent, and public perception. Every action is constrained by centuries of rules, and yet, within those constraints, there is room for discretion and occasionally for extraordinary decisions. This chapter explores the extraordinary question. Could King Charles legally and practically act to strip Meghan Markle of her titles, deny her demands, or issue an emergency order? And what does that really mean? Let's start with the basics. The crown holds certain legal powers, many of them ceremonial, some substantive, and most bound by constitutional conventions. A monarch can grant titles, approve honors, and oversee certain formalities. But these actions are not made in a vacuum. Parliament, legal precedent, and public expectation all shape the limits of royal authority. When a royal requests recognition or privileges, the decision isn't just about personal whim. It involves legal scrutiny, political considerations, and centuries of precedent. In essence, every choice the monarch makes is a balancing act, authority tempered by law, tradition, and optics. The question becomes more nuanced when it involves someone like Meghan Markle. She is a former senior royal, the former Duchess of Sussex. Titles confer privileges, but they also carry responsibilities, expectations, and obligations. Removing or restoring such titles is not simply a matter of personal choice. Legal counsel must consider historical precedents, statutory frameworks, and potential challenges. Public perception is equally critical. The monarchy's legitimacy depends not only on law but also on the confidence and support of the public. Every move has both a legal and symbolic dimension. Reports suggest that, in response to Meghan's demands, advisors explored multiple strategies. Could a partial concession satisfy her request without compromising authority? Could a firm refusal communicate clarity while minimizing personal fallout? Could a creative workaround achieve both ends? The palace had to navigate the intersection of legality, optics, and diplomacy. It's a realm few outsiders understand fully. A labyrinth of historical rules, precedent, and modern expectation where one misstep can reverberate across decades. Consider historical examples. Monarchs have occasionally revoked titles, disapproved claims, or asserted authority in dramatic ways. But each case was context-dependent, often influenced by political pressure, personal dynamics, or public scandal. There is no precise playbook for a situation like this. Meghan's request was unprecedented in modern times. A global media spotlight, substantial financial conditions, and the complex intersection of family and institutional expectation. This was territory where even the most experienced advisors had to tread carefully, analyzing every detail for legal and symbolic risk. Legal and procedural considerations aside, there's the human element. Even if the king has the power to act, should he? The monarchy is an institution, yes, but it is also a family. The personal implications of stripping a title, denying demands, or issuing an extraordinary order are profound. These are not abstract decisions. They affect relationships, trust, and emotional bonds. In many ways, the legal power is the easy part. The human cost is immeasurable. Every advisor knew that, and the king understood it acutely. Timing also played a crucial role. A monarch cannot act impulsively without considering both the immediate and long-term consequences. Yet delaying a decision in this context could signal weakness, indecision, or uncertainty. Reports suggest that the palace operated under intense pressure to respond quickly, balancing the urgency of the moment with the need for careful deliberation. Every hour mattered, every word mattered, and every leaked rumor carried weight. This is a unique dimension of royal authority in the modern age. The speed of information transforms decisions that once unfolded over months into moments of intense public scrutiny. Another layer to consider is precedent. Monarchs rarely act in isolation. Their decisions are interpreted in the context of historical continuity. Revoking or granting titles sets examples, signals boundaries, and communicates values. If Charles acted decisively in this instance, it could establish a modern precedent for how similar situations are handled in the future. If he hesitated, it might embolden others, challenge authority, or invite criticism. In short, every option carried both immediate consequences and lasting impact. Even more complex is the symbolic dimension. The monarchy is not only a legal institution but a symbol of stability, tradition, and continuity. Actions taken within it communicate to millions, citizens, Commonwealth nations, global audiences, that values, limits, and expectations are enforced. Denying a demand may appear harsh, but it asserts authority. Granting a demand may appear compassionate, but it risks weakening perceived power. The king had to navigate this symbolic landscape as carefully as any legal framework. And yet, despite all the rules, conventions, and pressures, extraordinary decisions are possible. Monarchs, though constrained, do exercise discretion in moments of crisis. A decisive action can send a powerful message, set boundaries, and communicate values. The challenge lies in executing it flawlessly. Timing, communication, legal framing, and optics must all align. One misstep, one misunderstood word, or one miscalculated move could have dramatic consequences. For Charles, this was the ultimate test, exercising authority within a framework that demands restraint, precision, and foresight. The palace reportedly explored every scenario. Partial concessions, strategic denials, emergency orders, and creative solutions that would maintain authority while addressing the emotional dimension. Every option was debated, scrutinized, and measured against history, law, and the public eye. Advisors weighed the risks, estimated the fallout, and considered the message each path would send to the monarchy, the family, and the world. And all the while, the clock ticked, amplifying tension and urgency. At its core, the question of whether a monarch can act is deceptively simple. The legal power exists, but it is inseparable from precedent, protocol, and public perception. The human, symbolic, and emotional dimensions are inseparable from the legal one. To act decisively requires courage, clarity, and an acute understanding of both history and modern expectations. King Charles faced this reality in stark terms. The choice was not only about what he could do, but also about what he should do and what he dared to do. Ultimately, extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary measures. A monarch may be bound by law, tradition, and protocol, but the interplay of authority, perception, and human emotion creates moments where decisive action is necessary. In this case, with Meghan Markle's unprecedented demands on the table, the king had to navigate a labyrinth of legal, symbolic, and personal considerations, weighing authority against familial connection, tradition against modern expectation, and principle against pragmatism. The path forward was narrow, fraught with risk, and consequential beyond imagination. When a crisis of this magnitude unfolds, it's tempting to imagine that the king simply makes a phone call, writes a memo, and the matter is settled. In reality, decisions at this level are never simple, never unilateral. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, an extraordinary meeting reportedly took place. A gathering of advisors, legal experts, senior courtiers, and members of the royal household convened to navigate the unprecedented storm created by Meghan Markle's demands. This was no ordinary council. This was an emergency meeting, a convergence of power, expertise, and influence, all focused on a decision that could reshape the monarchy itself. The scene inside the room has been described by insiders as tense, almost electric. Phones were silent. Papers shuffled. Legal briefs lay spread across long oak tables. Each advisor, each legal expert, each member of the household staff knew the gravity of the situation. One wrong move could not only destabilize the monarchy, but also damage the fragile balance of public trust. There was no margin for error. Every point was analyzed, every precedent examined, every potential reaction debated. At the center of it all was King Charles, a figure calm on the outside, but reportedly grappling with intense internal pressure. Advisors presented multiple scenarios: partial concessions, outright refusal, staged responses, and, most dramatically, the option of issuing an emergency order stripping Meghan of her titles. Each option carried risk, and each carried potential consequences that extended far beyond the immediate family. The king had to weigh the institutional impact against personal relationships and the public reaction against private loyalty. One of the most striking aspects of this meeting, insiders say, was the intensity of debate. Legal experts dissected precedent, weighing whether such an action had been taken before and what its ripple effects might be. Courtiers considered optics, public perception, and potential media fallout. PR advisors sketched out multiple messaging strategies, from carefully worded announcements to controlled leaks. Security officers assessed risks, anticipating possible threats or disruptions. It was a moment of coordination at the highest level, blending the personal, the political, and the procedural in a way that few outsiders could imagine. Emotion played an equally significant role. While strategy and legality were vital, the human element was impossible to ignore. Charles is not only a sovereign, but a father, and he reportedly felt the weight of personal relationships pressing against the demands of his office. Advisors encouraged him to consider the long-term consequences of each decision, not just for the monarchy, but for the family's cohesion and morale. Some reportedly argued for a conciliatory approach, emphasizing empathy and compromise. Others stressed authority, warning that yielding to demands could undermine centuries of tradition and diminish respect for the crown. The idea of an emergency order was, by all accounts, controversial. On paper, it was legally possible, but its execution required precision and strategic timing. It was not simply a piece of paper. It was a symbolic statement, a declaration of authority, and a public message all in one. Issuing such an order would have immediate legal ramifications, could influence media narratives, and send a signal to both supporters and critics around the world. Advisors debated language, tone, and potential fallout at length, aware that every word could become part of history. Even the room's atmosphere reportedly carried weight. Staff whispered in corners, exchanging updates on news cycles and social media speculation. Some courtiers, steeped in tradition, reportedly shook their heads at the unprecedented nature of the demands. Others, more attuned to modern dynamics, emphasized that the monarchy must adapt or risk irrelevance. Charles, seated at the head of the table, listened, weighed, and absorbed the counsel, fully aware that the decision rested with him alone. Timing was critical. Reports suggest the council worked late into the night, examining every possible contingency. What if the public reacted negatively? What if Meghan challenged the decision legally? What if the media narrative spun out of control? Each scenario was mapped, debated, and analyzed. Advisors meticulously considered how every action, word, or omission could shape both immediate outcomes and long-term perception. Every recommendation was scrutinized, and every suggestion came with warnings. One misstep, and the consequences could be catastrophic. It was not just legal and procedural considerations that defined the meeting. The emotional stakes were enormous. The king's relationship with Meghan, his broader family dynamics, and the potential for public perception of familial conflict all weighed heavily. Advisors reportedly reminded Charles that the monarchy's credibility depends not only on authority, but also on the image of fairness, compassion, and continuity. Balancing these dimensions in real time, under immense pressure, is an extraordinary challenge, even for the most experienced monarch. Ultimately, the Emergency Council distilled the options into a critical decision point. Partial compromise could placate Meghan but might be interpreted as weakness. Outright refusal would assert authority but could inflame public sentiment or familial tensions. Issuing an emergency order to strip titles, though drastic, offered a decisive solution that protected institutional integrity but carried profound emotional and symbolic weight. Each path was risky, and yet, inaction itself was a risk. Hesitation could be interpreted as indecision or vulnerability, magnifying the pressure. What makes this moment unforgettable is the convergence of all these factors: legal authority, historical precedent, personal relationships, public scrutiny, and media attention. No decision exists in isolation. Every move is magnified, every action interpreted, and every outcome analyzed. The king had to integrate centuries of tradition, the expectations of millions, and the complex dynamics of his own family, all while operating under intense global scrutiny. The stakes were staggering, the pressure immense, and the consequences potentially historic. As the night wore on, a consensus emerged, not in terms of unanimity, but clarity. The emergency order, though drastic, was increasingly seen as the path that would assert authority, protect the institution, and set a clear boundary. Advisors prepared drafts, debated phrasing, and anticipated counterarguments. Every word, every clause, every signature had to be precise. A misstep could undermine the entire strategy, turning a carefully calculated action into a public relations disaster. And yet, despite all the preparation, despite the legal frameworks and strategic planning, uncertainty remained. Monarchs can plan, prepare, and predict, but they cannot control perception, emotion, or reaction. What happens when the public, the media, or the individual directly affected responds unpredictably? Every scenario carried the potential for surprise, risk, and consequence. The Emergency Council could provide guidance, but the ultimate responsibility rested with the king. By the end of the night, it became clear a decision had to be made. Charles, after listening to counsel, reviewing legal precedent, and weighing the emotional and symbolic stakes, faced the moment of truth. The emergency council had prepared him, but it could not remove the burden of leadership, the weight of familial responsibility, or the human complexity of the situation. The choice was his alone, and the world would watch as history unfolded. History is full of moments when leaders must act decisively, when the weight of responsibility presses down, and every second counts. For King Charles, that moment arrived with unprecedented clarity and intensity. After days of negotiation, deliberation, and counsel, the time had come to act. The pressure was immense, legal, familial, public, and symbolic, all converging in a single, historic decision. What would a monarch do when personal loyalty clashes with institutional integrity? When family bonds strain under public scrutiny? When centuries of tradition demand authority and modern expectations demand empathy? The answer would shock the world. Reports suggest that the king's decision was made after careful, painstaking consideration. He weighed every argument presented by advisors, examined every precedent, and reflected deeply on the emotional and symbolic implications. Compromise had been explored, partial concessions considered. Yet, in the end, the choice was clear. To protect the institution, assert authority, and set a boundary that could not be crossed. The emergency order was drafted, signed, and prepared for immediate execution. This was not merely an administrative act. It was a declaration, a statement of principle, and a moment that would reverberate across history. The implications were staggering. Meghan Markle's titles, the privileges associated with them, and her formal recognition as a senior royal were stripped. This action, unprecedented in recent memory, sent shockwaves through the media, the public, and the royal family itself. Titles are not mere formalities. They are symbols of legitimacy, influence, and belonging. Removing them is both a legal and symbolic act, one that asserts authority and communicates boundaries. The decision was not personal alone. It was institutional, strategic, and historically significant. Inside the palace, reactions were intense. Advisors reportedly felt a mixture of relief, apprehension, and awe. The emergency council, which had debated, planned, and prepared, recognized the enormity of what had just occurred. Security teams monitored potential fallout. PR teams prepared messaging for global audiences. Legal experts reviewed implications for precedent and potential challenges. Even within this highly controlled environment, the emotional weight of the moment was palpable. This was not simply a bureaucratic action. It was a moment of history unfolding in real time. Public reaction was immediate and polarized. Media outlets around the world rushed to cover the story, framing it in terms of authority, drama, and family conflict. Headlines screamed of a historic royal showdown, and King Charles asserts unprecedented authority. Social media exploded with speculation, analysis, and opinion. Every gesture, word, and perceived nuance was dissected, debated, and broadcast. The global audience, invested in both the monarchy and Meghan Markle, was captivated. The decision became a defining moment, shaping narratives, opinions, and perceptions of both the king and Meghan.